China will continue to stand together with other developing countries. We firmly support greater representation and say of developing countries, especially African countries, in the international governance system. China's vote in the United Nations will always belong to the developing countries.
China's vote belongs to developing countries. Good news for the African continent. Now, world leaders gathered at the 70th session of the UN General Assembly this week, where they adopted 17 new Sustainable Development Goals. But if the United Nations' new plan is to be more successful than the last, Africa's voice will have to become louder and vital issues addressed with urgency. So will we finally see the reform the continent has been calling for? And how will these new development goals impact on the relationship between Africa and the United Nations? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Now, by adopting the new Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, world leaders gathered at the UN Sustainable Development Summit 2015 at the UN headquarters in New York opened the window into a new future. Here is what the top 5 of the 17 goals described as ambitious are. UN experts say the goals are achievable. Goal number 1 is to end all forms of poverty. Goal number 2, zero hunger. Goal number 3, good health and well-being. Goal number 4, quality education. And goal number 5, gender equality, now a standalone objective. Now, 34 of the 48 countries designated by the UN as least developed countries are in Africa, according to the United Nations. So SDGs are quite a big deal for the continent. But there is one problem here: funding. China stepped in with a much-needed shot in the arm when President Xi Jinping pledged $2 billion to facilitate implementation of SDGs as part of Beijing's efforts in fighting global poverty under the South-South cooperation. It will invest $12 billion in least developed countries by 2030. Now, between 2010 and 2012, China provided a total of $14.41 billion in grants, interest-free and concessional loans, of which 51.8% went to Africa. Between 2008 and 2009, developing countries exported more to one another than to developed countries. And since 2011, their total trade has been over $4 trillion. So does Africa's future lie with the South? And how can Africa tap into this cooperation to achieve its development goals and lift millions out of poverty? Now, President Xi Jinping used his first address to the United Nations General Assembly to call for a new type of international relations based on respect for sovereignty and different development models, where big countries and small countries are treated as equals. CCTV's Nathan King has more.
Calling on the world to reject the Cold War mindset and a winner-take-all mentality, Chinese President Xi Jinping said all countries are now interdependent and share common commitments to mankind.
The movement toward a multipolar world and the rise of emerging markets and developing countries have become an irresistible trend of history.
President Xi said China stands behind the current international security structure, but he called for a world of partnerships, not alliances. And demonstrating China's commitment to the UN, Xi announced $1 billion over 10 years to promote a peace and development fund. And for UN peacekeeping, China is pledging to build a standby force of 8,000 troops ready to deploy at short notice, and a permanent police squad, and another $100 million for rapid reaction peacekeeping for the African Union, cementing China's role as the biggest contributor of peacekeepers of all the permanent members of the UN Security Council. And reassuring the world on China's rapid rise, Xi said China will never seek to dominate.
China will continue to participate in building world peace. We are committed to peaceful development. No matter how the international landscape may evolve and how strong China may become, China will never pursue hegemony, expansion, or sphere of influence.
And in a sign of confidence in the Chinese economy, President Xi Jinping also said it was happy to share its development model with the rest of the world, calling on countries, if they wanted to jump on the express train of Chinese development. Also, the Chinese president explaining what the China dream was to the rest of the world, talking about a national renewal that would not just benefit people in China, but also have knock-on effects for development for countries of the region and the world. Nathan King, CCTV, at the United Nations in New York.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has announced a $2 billion fund to support South-South cooperation. In an interview with CCTV, the UN Deputy Secretary General Jan Eliasson spoke of how China plays a very important role in the development of the Global South.
What is your take on China's contribution to the South-South cooperation?
Well, this has been wonderful. I mean, if you look at the overall pattern of the Chinese technical cooperation in the last 20, 30 years, the investment from China to many of the developing countries, as I said, whether it is in infrastructure, development of agriculture, development of ports, the railways and road, there has been a very substantial contribution from China. But the challenge is that still the requirement of all these countries is so big that it is not enough. Have to really make sure that they continue to get investment. The most important thing is for these countries, how do you create the domestic productive capacity as well? And there is a lot of experience that China has in terms of restructuring their economy. We do believe that as the capacity of China further grows up, I'm sure that the investment and the trade as well as technical cooperation will also continue to grow. So that's also one of the expectations of the event.
We're going to take a short break now, but when we return, I'll have expert guests to help unpack Africa and the Sustainable Development Goals. To stay with us.
It has been 3 years since our first bulletin, and from that standing start we've taken you across Africa and beyond. We've provided a voice for all Africans.
My dream for Africa is a good education for all.
A platform for its people.
Come to Africa, make money, and help us develop our countries.
No one else takes you closer to the stories the world is talking about, or provides the images that will stay with you forever. This is an achievement that has won recognition from global leaders.
中央电视台非洲分台，他们奉行的理念是用非洲人的角度来看非洲，用非洲人的理念来解释非洲。
And all of this has just happened in 3 years. The best part is, we're just getting started. This is CCTV Africa, your African news channel.
Africa is not looking for handouts. Rather, it is looking for partners in massive infrastructural development, in creating and exploiting the value chains from the God-given natural resources, and in improving the quality of life of the continent's citizens. The entire world stands to benefit from an economically empowered African continent than from one emasculated by deprivation and with an over-dependence on others.
Well, that was Zimbabwean President Robert Mugabe addressing the 70th UN General Assembly this week. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, President Mugabe was not the only leader calling for reform of the UN Security Council. Other African leaders also pointed out the continent's underrepresentation, as well as the rising security concerns in various regions.
It is unacceptable and unjustifiable that more than 1 billion people in the African continent are still excluded as permanent members of the key decision-making structure of the United Nations Security Council. A continent with a smaller population than Africa is represented by 3 countries on the United Nations Security Council as permanent members. This is unfair. The UN cannot pretend that the world has not changed since 1945. We are no longer colonies. We are free, independent, sovereign states.
The declaration that we have adopted today testifies to the urgency and the necessity for action by all of us. It is not for want of commitment that previous initiatives have failed or could not be fully realized. What seemed to be lacking in the past were political will and the required global partnership to pursue and implement the programs to which we committed ourselves.
Global terrorism, as well as violent extremism, remain a major threat, not only to the Republic of Kenya, but also to the entire world. In the recent past, Al-Shabaab terrorists have been targeting the civilian population in Kenya on the pretext that Kenya has deployed her troops in Somalia. The continued threat by Al-Shabaab has had a great impact on Kenya's national security and economy at large. Kenya therefore calls upon the international community to take strong and enforceable action in tackling Al-Shabaab, as well as other terrorist groups, including the phenomenon of foreign fighters.
واسمحوا لي إذن أن أتساءل عن عدد المسلمين.
Allow me then to pose this question. How many Muslims must fall victim to the abomination of terrorism and extremism before the world recognizes that all of us, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, are at war with the same enemy? That we face the same threat? How much blood must be spilled in countries that suffer from the terrorist scourge before the international community awakens to the reality of this plague, which Egypt is now confronting at the forefront of Islamic countries as the first line of defense? When will the international community acknowledge that there is no alternative to solidarity between all people to defeat this evil wherever it exists? Today, Syria is being torn apart as it faces the threat of division, an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, and the exposed ambitions of regional parties. In response to this dire situation, Egypt called on Syrian national parties to meet in Cairo to formulate a clear plan for the interim period in accordance with Geneva.
And now to help plan Africa's path to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, I have expert guests standing by in Nairobi, Dr. Adam Zolos. He's a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science at the University of Nairobi. He's joining us here in Kenya. And in Beijing, Jie Shidong, he's a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. To you both, thank you for joining in this discussion. Jie Shidong, I'll start off with you in Beijing. Now, China's President Xi Jinping announced at a South-South cooperation roundtable at the UN that a major initiative to help developing countries reduce poverty there. And he said in his words that no country should be left behind. What's your take on this and on China's contribution to the South-South cooperation?
Yes, China itself is a developing country. And China and other developed countries have provided mutual assistance to each other in the past few decades. So now China is developing and has enjoyed unprecedented economic growth in the past few decades. Now China can, with its capacity, can help other developing countries develop. So China always believes that no country should be left behind in development. Actually, development in each country offers great opportunities for mutual cooperation. So that's why China attaches great importance to that. And China will contribute more to the development of other developing countries, especially countries in Africa.
All right, Dr. Adams Olodo, China's president also announced that China will be providing some $2 billion to support the South-South cooperation. What are we seeing here?
What we are seeing here is that for a very long time there has been what has been called North-South cooperation, and that since developing countries needed capital, very much needed capital, given that the factors of production are land, labor, and capital, and that Africa, and therefore most developing countries, had both land and labor, which was largely unskilled, that what they needed was capital, and mostly that capital was being given from the north. But we find that when it was coming from the north, it also came with a lot of conditionalities. And I think China is now saying that that capital doesn't necessarily need to come from the north. It can come from one of the South's partners, which has itself showed that there is potential and there is ability to get out of poverty and to get out of the developing status. And it appears China is saying that we shall give you aid, but not tied with conditionalities, so that you realize your potential.
All right, Dr. Olo, we are seeing now a new push for the South-South cooperation, but what have been the challenges, though, to this cooperation in the past? What experiences have these countries learned that can help propel the cooperation to newer heights?
Well, I think that in any cooperation, usually you need a leader. And one of the challenges that the developing countries had always faced was that they lacked a leader with the muscle, both economically and politically, who would put them on the international scene. Remember, in the 1970s, most developing countries had asked for a new international economic order, where they were basically arguing that the structural nature of the international system was in favor of the North against the South. But that didn't realize much, and it was basically because there was no outright leader who could show direction. And I think China, as a rising power, is now showing that it will take that leadership, and since it sits in the very apex of the world body of the UN, where key decisions are made or are vetoed, then it can always side with developing countries on very pertinent issues. And I think that the other issue that one has to look at is that China has not been known to really come up with what you can call socio-economic suggestions or even agendas. Most of the time they have been associated with infrastructural, mega infrastructural development, building policies for presidents in developing countries. And for a very long time, they were not known for focusing on education, on health, on women issues, and poverty eradication. And basically, I think they are saying that they are going to fill that gap now. The challenge for that is, will their words become a reality? I think that's what the world will be looking at.
All right, will the words become a reality? Xia Shidong in Beijing, is China now taking that leadership role?
Well, actually, China will work with other developing countries, and China will, share a bigger responsibility, actually, for common development with other developing countries. Of course, in many cases, China, comes up with initiatives, proposals, and recommendations to other developing countries, but as always, China actually is aware of the needs of these developed countries. So all this kind of cooperation is carried out on a basis of mutual respect and on same equal footing. That is a basic pillar of China's foreign policy. So, but anyway, China will continue to make initiative. For example, in the use of the fund, South-South China Cooperation Fund and the Climate Change Fund, and as well as other initiatives. For example, China will establish 600 programs in developing countries in education, in health, in women's empowerment, so on and so forth. And we'll discuss with these countries. So coordination is very important. Well, you may call it leadership, but I mean coordination is a better word.
All right, Chiashidong, another issue though that did also come out of the president's speech there was the whole question of funding for the African Union standby force, and that China will be giving the African Union about $100 million for this facility. China now seems to be looking quite seriously though at Africa's peace and security issues. Why is that?
Yes, peace and development should go hand in hand. Without development, no countries can have a better living standard, and actually that is maybe kind of a breeding ground and for a lot of social problems, national problems. And without peace, simply you cannot have the environment for growth, economic growth, for development. So in the past years, China has devoted a lot of effort to development, the needs of development in Africa. But as time goes on, China has realized that, well, it should do more in the area of peace and security. So in the past few years, actually, China has stepped up efforts to work with African countries, especially the African Union, to assist in the peace and security arena. So that's why China has now decided to devote more funds to that. And also, China has said that we'll establish a 8,000 force as a standby force for UN peacekeeping efforts. Actually, that will, in future, I presume that will go, much of that force will be used in Africa, in addition to joint efforts with African Union in its building of a standby force for peacekeeping.
All right, Dr. Adam Tolo, you're watching this, of course, and Africa has been trying for a long time to set up a standby force of its own. What's reaction, though? What's your reaction to that statement?
Well, my reaction to that statement is basically that if you look at integration of its efforts anywhere in the world, you can either take the economic route, or you can take the security route, or you can take both. Scholars have argued that an integration based on the security parameter is more long-lasting than the one based on economics. And if you look at our regional economic communities, and also you look at the standby forces that were created in the different regions, basically they were left at that initiation stage, basically because of lack of finance, that member countries were not contributing to making sure that this African standby force became operational. And therefore, you needed some financing from outside. Of course, initially, it is the EU that has been financing most of these African initiatives. And as they say, whoever calls the piper plays the tune. And to that extent, the EU has come with some conditionalities on how it wants this standby force to operate. By China offering to now pump in some money, it's basically saying that, look here, the South can deal with its own problems, the South can fund its own initiatives, and the South will not put any conditionalities on how this standby force should be created. The rule-making and decision-making will be basically by the South and funded by the South.
All right, I just want to get a final comment from both of you, though, and another issue, though, that did come out of the UN General Assembly this week has been the whole question of the Sustainable Development Goals. Though, Dr. Olo, are you optimistic about Africa, though, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, and are they better than the MDGs?
Well, basically, that's something which one can say is a work in progress. If you look at the contradictions in Africa, it is one of inequality even within African states, to the extent that you'll find that the place that you find the elites and the place where you find the masses at times is contradictory. And if you're talking of sustainable development, you're basically talking of inclusive development, a development that makes sure that everybody, as China has been trying to say, moves together. And that moving together should not only be at the global stage where the North and South walk side by side and move together. It should also be within African states in which the elites and the governing elements within it move together with the masses. And that, to me, is still a big challenge, because I haven't yet seen the vision, the will, the interest to make sure that equitable and inclusive development is realized within African states. They can go to all those international forums and talk about it, but when you come and look at the policies that are on the ground, the realities that are on the ground, that, to me, still appears to be a vision that might not be realized in the near future.
Jia Shidong, do you think that's a vision, the Sustainable Development Goals, that will be a vision that may not be realized in the next 15 years?
I should say that the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, are very, very ambitious for many countries, even for China. But, for the past 15 years, actually, China has achieved the goals set for their Millennium Development Agenda, reducing, for example, the population in poverty by more than 400 million. So, of course, for other developed countries, especially countries in developing in Africa, this is a huge challenge to realize, because different countries have different conditions and different levels of development. But on the whole, many of these goals, can be met with joint efforts, with assistance with other countries, from other countries, for example, China and developed countries, and for example, for the poverty. And a lot of factors affect the efforts to deal with poverty, but assistance, capacity building should be one. And China certainly will help African countries, for example, in infrastructure building, railway transportation, and also education, health, and so forth. I think that, yes, they are hard to achieve, but it's not impossible.
All right, we'll leave it there for the moment, gentlemen. Very insightful debate indeed. And that's all we have time for this week. But thank you to my guests for their insights. In Nairobi, Dr. Adam Solo, he's a senior political science lecturer at the University of Nairobi. And in Beijing, Jia Shidong, he's a senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Remember, you can continue this conversation at home through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. To join us again next week for another edition of Talk Africa. Goodbye.